The first shipment cleared Canadian customs on a Wednesday. 47 BYD electric vehicles. BYD, the Chinese automaker that just surpassed Tesla as the world's largest EV seller, rolling off a container ship in Vancouver, tagged for dealerships in Ontario and British Columbia, fully compliant with Canadian trade law, carrying 0% tariff under Canada's new framework agreement with China's automotive export sector. That shipment was not a surprise to anyone paying attention. Canada signaled it was coming 6 weeks ago when it restructured its EV import schedule. What was a surprise, what produced the closed-door emergency meeting at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation in Washington on Thursday morning, what produced the 3 urgent phone calls from Republican senators to the U.S. Trade Representative's office that afternoon, was the document that accompanied the shipment. A legal opinion from 3 Canadian trade attorneys, published and publicly available, concluding that under the current terms of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, Canadian dealerships can resell those Chinese EVs into the American market, legally, without additional American tariff exposure, through the back door that the trade war with Canada just opened. Trump didn't just impose tariffs on Canada and trigger the systematic economic separation that has been documented in this series. Trump didn't just hand Mark Carney the political mandate and the strategic justification to restructure Canada's trade relationships with China, Europe, and Asia. Trump created a tariff architecture so aggressive that it accelerated Canada's pivot toward Chinese manufacturing partnerships, and then failed to close the legal mechanism in the USMCA that allows Canadian resold goods to re-enter the American market under treaty terms. He planned for tariff pressure to isolate China from North American markets. He got a Canadian pivot that is now functioning as a legal conduit for exactly the Chinese goods the tariffs were designed to exclude. And in the gap between the tariff strategy and the legal mechanism that strategy forgot to close, 47 BYD vehicles are rolling toward Canadian dealerships. And the American auto industry is doing math that produces answers nobody in Detroit or Washington wants to say out loud. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how this happened. Not the political version, the legal and trade mechanism version, the one that explains why 3 Canadian trade attorneys can publish an opinion that produces emergency meetings in Washington. I am going to walk you through the specific USMCA provisions at issue, the specific Canadian trade framework changes that created the window, and the specific numbers on what this means for the American auto industry, for the workers in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana who build the cars, and for the retirement accounts of everyone who owns equity in Ford, GM, or Stellantis. And I am going to tell you why the world you are waking up in today is measurably more dangerous for American automotive manufacturing dominance than the one you woke up in before. A trade war with Canada inadvertently built a bridge for Chinese EVs. Imagine you build a wall around your property to keep out a competitor. You spend enormous resources on the wall. You tell everyone the wall is working. And then one morning you look out and see your neighbor, the one you built the wall to protect against your competitor, has installed a gate in their section of the shared fence. The gate is legal. It was always legal. You just never thought your neighbor would use it. And your competitor is walking through it with 47 vehicles and a legal opinion that says the gate stays open. Hold that thought, because that is not a metaphor. That is the specific legal and trade architecture that produced Thursday's emergency meeting in Washington. Let us rewind the clock. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Did the administration's trade team know that aggressive Canada tariffs would accelerate Canada's pivot toward Chinese automotive partnerships? Or was this a consequence that nobody in Washington modeled before the tariffs were imposed? This did not start with the BYD shipment. It started with a Canadian government decision made quietly in February, buried under the noise of the Iran operation and the war powers debate that received almost no American press coverage at the time. Canada announced a restructuring of its electric vehicle import framework, specifically a reduction of its EV import tariff on Chinese-manufactured vehicles from 100% to 25%, phased down from 100 over 18 months. Canada framed this as an industrial policy decision. Canadian consumers were paying premium prices for EVs because of limited supply. Canadian automakers were not producing enough domestic EVs to meet demand, and the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs was protecting a supply gap rather than a domestic industry. That framing was accurate. But the decision was also something else. It was a signal, deliberate, visible, and timed, that Canada's economic policy was decoupling from American trade priorities. The United States had imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Canada was cutting its tariff on the same vehicles to 25% and trending toward lower. Those two tariff schedules, moving in opposite directions, created the price differential that makes the USMCA resale mechanism economically interesting. When the Canadian tariff falls far enough below the American tariff that a Chinese EV can be imported into Canada, sold through a Canadian dealership, and then resold into the American market at a price below what a directly imported Chinese EV would cost under American tariffs, the arbitrage is legal, documented, and potentially enormous in scale. Canada's entire EV import pivot was built on a straightforward economic calculation that the Carney government made explicit in its industrial policy white paper published in March. Canadian consumers need affordable EVs. Chinese manufacturers produce the most affordable EVs in the world. The prior tariff structure was designed to align with American trade policy rather than Canadian consumer interest, and Canadian trade policy now serves Canadian interests first. That is not an anti-American statement. It is a post-dependence statement. The same structural separation that this series has documented across energy, agriculture, critical minerals, and financial partnerships is now visible in automotive. Canada is not trying to harm the American auto industry. Canada is governing for Canada. The harm to the American auto industry is the collateral consequence of a trade war that Canada did not start. Receipt number 1. The USMCA provision at issue, documented by the legal opinion and confirmed by trade attorneys on both sides of the border. According to the legal opinion published by Cassidy Leger and Associates, a Canadian trade law firm whose principals include a former Canadian trade commissioner, and confirmed in its general framework by two American trade attorneys quoted in the Wall Street Journal's Thursday coverage, Article 32.10 of the USMCA governing rules of origin for resale of goods does not, in its current form, contain language that would prevent a good lawfully imported into Canada from being subsequently sold to an American buyer at the Canadian tariff rate rather than the American tariff rate, provided the good has been in Canadian commerce for a qualifying period and through a qualifying transaction. The qualifying period is 12 months. The qualifying transaction is a bona fide retail sale. Now stop right there. That provision was written to protect genuine Canadian commerce from American protectionist measures, to prevent the United States from taxing goods that were legitimately Canadian. It was not written to anticipate a scenario in which Canada and the United States had wildly divergent tariff schedules on the same category of goods from a third country, and in which a Canadian dealership could function as a legal transit mechanism for goods the United States had specifically chosen to exclude. The provision does not contain language that distinguishes between those two scenarios. It just says 12 months and a bona fide retail sale. The attorneys say it is legal. The auto industry says it is catastrophic. The USMCA negotiators apparently did not see it coming, and the first 47 vehicles are already through the gate. Receipt number 2. What the American auto industry's emergency meeting actually produced, and the number nobody wants to say publicly. Here is the part that should make your blood boil. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation's Thursday meeting was attended by senior representatives from Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, Toyota's American operations, and Hyundai's American manufacturing division. According to two people familiar with the meeting's proceedings, described to Reuters and not denied by the Alliance, the central topic was not the 47 BYD vehicles. The 47 vehicles are a test case. The central topic was the scale projection. If the USMCA resale mechanism holds, as described in the Canadian legal opinion, and if Chinese automakers, BYD, SAIC, Chery, Geely, systematically route their North American export strategy through Canadian import and resale, the annual volume of Chinese EVs entering the American market through the Canadian mechanism could reach, by the Alliance's own internal modeling, between 300,000 and 800,000 vehicles per year within 36 months. 300,000 to 800,000 Chinese EVs per year. In a market where Ford's total F-150 Lightning sales last year were approximately 24,000 units. In a market where GM's entire EV lineup sold approximately 75,000 units last year. The scale projection does not represent a competitive challenge. It represents a potential structural disruption of the American EV transition. The pivot from internal combustion to electric that every American automaker has spent billions of dollars and years of development building toward. If Chinese EVs, priced at 30 to 40% below comparable American models, enter the American market at scale through the Canadian mechanism, the American automakers who bet their futures on the EV transition are competing against a cost structure they cannot match, in a market they were counting on, through a legal gap they did not know existed until Wednesday. The government told you the tariffs were protecting the American auto industry. Then we learned the tariffs accelerated the Canadian pivot that opened the gate. That is not a tariff policy. That is a tariff policy that built the problem it was designed to prevent. If this is making the mechanism clear, not as a political argument, but as a trade and legal architecture argument, in a way you have not seen assembled this directly anywhere else, you are ahead of most people trying to understand why the auto industry meeting happened and what it actually means for the workers and investors who depend on American automotive manufacturing. Hit subscribe right now. This channel tracks the architecture beneath the headline, and the next development in this sequence is already visible in the Canadian Trade Ministry's calendar. Now compare what the administration's trade team is saying publicly about the USMCA mechanism to what the legal opinion and the auto industry projections actually show. The U.S. Trade Representative's office issued a statement on Thursday, and this is a direct quote from the official statement. The United States has the strongest trade enforcement tools in the world, and we will not allow bad actors to circumvent American trade law. The legal opinion does not describe circumvention. It describes compliance. It describes a scenario where the Canadian trade attorneys are not arguing that their clients can get around the law. They are arguing that under the law as written, the resale mechanism is legal. And the trade representative's response is to describe legal compliance as bad actor circumvention. A senior trade counsel at one of the American automakers, speaking anonymously because their company is in active discussions with the administration, said of the USMCA statement, calling it circumvention doesn't close the provision. You need a renegotiation or a clarification ruling, and both of those take months to years. They were told the tools are the strongest in the world. What they actually need is a specific fix to a specific legal text, and the strongest tools in the world cannot fix a legal text through a press statement. These are not serious people managing a serious legal and trade vulnerability with the precision the American auto industry needs right now. These are communicators performing enforcement while the gate is open. Here is the part that should keep every auto worker, every auto investor, and every community whose economy is built around automotive manufacturing awake tonight. Receipt number 3. The competitive pricing picture and what it means for American EV production at scale. The BYD Seagull, the entry-level BYD electric vehicle that is the vehicle of focus in the Canadian import framework, has a manufacturer's suggested retail price in China of approximately $10,000. In Canada, after the current 25% tariff and import costs, it prices at approximately 18,000 Canadian dollars, roughly $13,000 at current exchange rates. The comparable American-made entry-level EV, the Chevrolet Equinox EV, starts at $34,995. The price gap between a BYD Seagull entering the American market through the Canadian mechanism and a Chevrolet Equinox EV built in an American plant by an American worker is approximately $22,000 per vehicle. $22,000 per vehicle. That price gap does not close through manufacturing efficiency improvements or supply chain optimization on the American side. It closes through subsidy, federal EV tax credits, state incentives, financing programs, or it does not close at all. And the federal EV tax credit, currently set at $7,500, gets the gap to $14,500. Still a $14,500 price difference per vehicle in favor of the Chinese competitor entering through the Canadian gate. At 300,000 to 800,000 units per year, against an American EV industry that needed this market to justify the billions spent building it. So what does this mean for you? Not for trade attorneys. For the person watching this. If you work in automotive manufacturing, in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, or any of the states where auto plants are the economic spine of the community, here is the specific and documented mechanism by which this reaches your job. American automakers have been restructuring their workforce and their capital allocation for the past 5 years around the assumption that the American EV market would grow at a rate that justified the investment. Ford's Blue Oval City in Tennessee, a $5.6 billion investment. GM's Ultium sells battery plants in Ohio and Tennessee, another $7 billion. Stellantis's retooled Sterling Heights assembly plant in Michigan. These investments were made against a projected market share that assumed Chinese EV competitors would be excluded from the American market by the 100% tariff. If the Canadian resale mechanism allows Chinese EVs into the market at scale, at a price point that captures the entry-level and mid-range segments those American plants are building for, the market share projection that justified the investment changes. When the market share projection changes, the utilization rate of those plants changes. When utilization falls, production schedules change. When production schedules change, shift counts change. When shift counts change, the workers on the second and third shifts find out at the shift scheduling meeting. The investment is already made. The plants are already built. The workers are already hired. The question is, what happens to their hours when the market they were built for turns out to have a gate in the fence? If you hold retirement savings with any exposure to American automotive equities, Ford, GM, Stellantis, or the supplier network that includes thousands of publicly traded companies, here is the specific market mechanism. Ford stock fell 4.8% on Thursday, the day the Canadian legal opinion published. GM fell 3.6%. Stellantis fell 5.1% in European trading. Those single-day moves are not panic. They are pricing. The market updating its assessment of the competitive landscape for American EV production based on a legal opinion that opened a market access pathway the prior models had not included. If the USMCA resale mechanism holds, if the renegotiation or clarification ruling takes the 12 to 24 months that Trade Council says it realistically requires, the market has 300,000 to 800,000 Chinese EVs per year to price into its forecast for American automaker revenue at 30 to 40% lower prices. In the market segment American automakers have spent the most building toward. The stock prices on Thursday were not the end of the pricing adjustment. They were the beginning. If you live in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, or any automotive-dependent community, here is the specific economic mechanism that connects this trade development to your property values, your local tax base, and your community's services. The auto industry is the single largest private employer in Michigan. It is the second largest in Ohio. When auto plant utilization falls, the economic multiplier effect works in reverse. For every direct auto industry job affected, an estimated 4 to 6 indirect jobs in the supply chain, services, and local economy are affected. The United Auto Workers contract guarantees that layoffs trigger specific severance and benefit obligations that cost the automakers money they would rather spend on the EV transition. The local tax base that funds the schools, the roads, and the emergency services in auto-dependent communities is tied to property values that are tied to employment levels that are tied to plant utilization. All of that chain begins at the gate, in the fence, that 47 BYD vehicles just walked through. If you are a voter in one of the Midwest swing states that determined the 2024 election and that will determine the 2026 midterm, here is the political mechanism that connects Thursday's auto industry emergency meeting to the electoral map. The promise of the trade war with China was that aggressive tariffs would protect American manufacturing jobs. The result of the trade war with Canada is that Canada's pivot toward China has created the mechanism by which Chinese EVs can enter the American market at scale through a legal pathway American tariffs cannot currently reach. The workers in the Blue Oval City and the Ultium Cells plants who were told the tariffs were protecting their jobs are now in plants whose market share projections have just been materially downgraded by a legal opinion from 3 Canadian trade attorneys. The political promise and the economic reality are diverging in exactly the communities that are most sensitive to that divergence. And the divergence is visible. It is at the dealership. It is on the stock ticker. It is in the shift scheduling memo. It is 47 vehicles and a legal opinion, and a gate that should have been closed before the trade war began. The administration is on television describing strong trade enforcement tools and bad actor circumvention. The legal opinion says compliance, not circumvention. The USMCA provision says 12 months and a bona fide retail sale. The auto industry's internal projection says 300,000 to 800,000 vehicles per year. The stock prices on Thursday said the market already knows. The $5.6 billion Blue Oval City in Tennessee was built for a market that just got a gate installed in its fence. The $22,000 per vehicle price gap does not close with a press statement. The workers on the second shift in Michigan do not know yet what the shift scheduling memo will say when the utilization numbers arrive. All of those things are true simultaneously. Only the press statement is at the podium. Here is the hard truth. The trade war with Canada was designed to produce leverage, to bring Canada to the negotiating table and extract concessions. What it produced instead was Canada's systematic acceleration of the pivots the United States was most vulnerable to. And now, with Thursday's legal opinion, a Chinese automotive partnership that uses the very trade agreement the United States negotiated to protect American manufacturing as the mechanism to route Chinese manufacturing into the American market. The irony is structural. The USMCA was negotiated by this administration in the first term specifically to strengthen American manufacturing protections. The trade war with Canada in the second term has activated a provision in that same agreement that may do more damage to American automotive manufacturing than NAFTA ever did. The administration did not intend this outcome. Intentions do not close trade law gaps. Renegotiations do. And renegotiations with a partner that has been systematically treated as an adversary take longer and cost more than renegotiations with a partner that has been treated as an ally. The moral verdict is this: the trade war with Canada was not fought to protect American workers. American workers are now discovering what it was actually protecting, and the answer is arriving at Canadian dealerships 47 vehicles at a time. Where does this go from here? I see three paths. The first is the emergency renegotiation. The administration, recognizing the urgency of the USMCA resale mechanism gap, fast-tracks a clarification request to the USMCA Free Trade Commission, the joint body that administers the agreement and has authority to issue binding clarifications on disputed provisions. Canada sits on that commission. Canada has, as of this week, no particular incentive to close a gate that serves Canadian consumer interests and advances the Canada-China automotive partnership that the Carney government has been building for months. The renegotiation is possible. It requires Canada's agreement. Canada's agreement requires the United States to offer something Canada wants. And the list of things Canada wants from the United States, tariff relief, restored diplomatic respect, acknowledgement that the trade war was misconceived, is exactly the list the administration has been unwilling to provide. The renegotiation is the right answer. It is not a fast answer, and it is not free. But even if it succeeds, the 47 vehicles are in Canadian commerce. The 12-month clock is running. The window is open until the renegotiation closes it. That is a year in which the Chinese EV routing strategy can be established, tested, and scaled. And once scaled, the infrastructure of Canadian EV distribution does not get dismantled because a legal text was clarified. The distribution network, once built, stays. The second path is the tariff escalation. The administration, unwilling to acknowledge that the Canada trade war created the vulnerability, responds by imposing additional tariffs on Canadian goods generally, or specifically on vehicles imported from Canada that contain Chinese-manufactured components above a threshold percentage. This is legally available under Section 232 National Security Provisions and under the existing tariff framework. It does not require USMCA renegotiation. It does require Canada to respond. Canada's response to prior American tariff escalations has been targeted retaliation against American agricultural exports, American consumer goods in Canadian markets, and American financial services. The escalation path closes the EV gate, but it opens other gates. It accelerates the Canada-China partnership rather than slowing it. It gives Carney the domestic political mandate for an even more aggressive decoupling from American trade dependence. And it adds another layer of cost to the $5 gas and the supply chain disruptions and the $14 billion per month Iran operation that are already compressing American household budgets. The gate closes. The wall gets more expensive, and the neighbor builds a bigger gate somewhere else. The third path is the Chinese EV flood. This is the one nobody wants to say out loud. The renegotiation stalls. The escalation option is judged too politically costly given the existing trade war damage. The legal mechanism holds. Chinese automakers, BYD first, then SAIC, Geely, and Chery, established dedicated Canadian import and distribution networks specifically designed to route into the American market through the USMCA resale mechanism. The volume scales from 47 test case vehicles to thousands per quarter to hundreds of thousands per year as the legal pathway is proven, the distribution infrastructure is built, and the price advantage drives consumer adoption. American automakers, unable to compete on price in the entry-level and mid-range EV segments, begin pulling back their EV investment timelines, not canceling the plants that are already built, but slowing the next phase of investment. The workers in those plants are not laid off. They are not fully utilized. The difference between a fully utilized auto plant and an underutilized one is not visible in the employment statistics. It is visible in the overtime reports, the second shift schedules, the supplier contract renewals, and the community tax receipts 6 to 12 months later. Normal left the building a long time ago, and there are no more guardrails. None. What remains is the legal opinion, the USMCA provision, the 47 vehicles, and the 300,000 to 800,000 per year projection that is sitting on the desk of every auto industry executive in Detroit. They are not panicking, they are doing math. And the math is not producing the number the trade war promised to produce. Here is what I know for certain, regardless of which path this takes. The American automotive industry's EV transition was built on a market access assumption, that the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs would hold, that the American market would belong to American manufacturers long enough to build the scale and cost efficiencies to compete. That assumption has been materially undermined. Not destroyed, undermined. The gate is open, the clock is running, the scale projection is on the desk, and the administration that built the tariff wall is spending its communications capacity calling legal compliance bad actor circumvention instead of doing the thing that actually closes the gate. The workers in the plants that were built on the assumption deserve better than that.